All right. Welcome everybody. Here I have a special special guest. I got Trey, Telosbound. I know he also runs a theology channel, Telosbound. So Trey, just to kind of because I know I've heard your like coming about story a couple of times from your videos of you talking to other people, but I guess just for like my audience and for myself, what is like your main focus of the work in your channel and like just the things that you're trying to write about?
Well, hi. Thanks for having me. I guess my channel is uh, mostly focused on philosophy, but I am an Eastern Orthodox Christian, and I basically my overall project is trying to read philosophy through a Christian lens, and not just in a way that isn't just in a very superficial way, uh, theologizing philosophy, but actually engaging with the philosophers themselves and acknowledging that they are serious. There are very serious philosophers, atheists and non-atheists alike, that need to be engaged with. And the something that Orthodox Christianity really stresses is that truth is, well, for one, truth is Christ, the Logos, and all truth, whether or not it is explicitly framed within an Orthodox framework, all truth ultimately points back to Jesus Christ. So I guess when I realized this, and I realized that a lot of stuff in modern philosophy is truthful, I realized that there has to be a way to give a theological reading of modern philosophy, and I've just begun doing that, and it's been very fruitful. And I think that, and it's not just me. There's a lot of other people doing this, and I think that this is the way Christians should approach philosophy, not just demonizing it, not just calling them degenerates or whatever, but actually looking at what they're saying and trying to figure out how they can fit within a Christian framework. So my videos are, a lot of them are just talking about the philosophers themselves when I find something valuable, and not explicitly trying to uh, frame it in a from a Christian perspective. But I've begun doing that more as well. And my writing, I've written one book, and I'm planning on I have a second edition of it coming out. That's much better, because the first one I'm just not satisfied with. But I'm also doing another, my second book. I'm planning on the death of God, and that would, for example, be trying to read the death of God from an actual Christian lens. And yeah, so that's basically what I do. I make philosophy videos, but overall, I am an Orthodox Christian. Christianity is the most important thing to me, and my goal is to read philosophy through a traditional Christian lens, and show how it actually testifies to the truth of Jesus Christ.
Yeah, that's usually like I find one of the biggest problems I think when having Christianity and philosophy is that I think people when they start hearing this entanglement, um, one you could say from a Christian perspective, one they're afraid that you might be twisting the theology to conform to the philosophy. But then there's the other way around where the people that are not Christians, they're afraid that you are sort of twisting the philosophical concepts to the theology.
Mm-hmm.
And that's always a danger. But I think at the same time, and I'm pretty sure you know this, is that there's this gap of language, right? And I was watching one of Cadell's videos with Nietzsche and Christianity, and he had a guest on there, and he was asking him about, do you necessarily have to agree that heaven and hell are ontological realities. Um, and I forgot the guy's name. I think his name was started with a P. It's like Philip, I believe, or Peter. Um, he said a good answer. He's also an Orthodox Christian. He basically said that we have to keep in mind that there's this language gap, and that this emphasis on what they mean by heaven and hell is there's a discrepancy by the way we look at it now as the way we interpret that. Even though it's still ambiguous, I thought it was a decent answer to kind of show the discrepancy of language. Um, but to kind of go on to, if you want to comment on that, you can. If not, I have another question for you.
Uh, well, uh, yeah, I would. I really don't have much to say because I just agree with you on that for sure. And really, all I'd say is that I would just say to go back to the very beginning of what you said. I do think there's a. I think that one of the big reasons why I'm very motivated to do what I do is because I didn't come to philosophy from Christianity. It was actually the other way around. So for me, I would say there's definitely the risk of me being biased towards philosophy in a way, as opposed to trying in terms of, like, as you said, like reading theology incorrectly through a philosophical lens. And I definitely think that is a risk um, that is involved. But really, ultimately, because I do believe in that Christianity is the truth, I do think that there is a sense in which every philosophical concept that is true already is Christian in a way. So for me, it's more just highlighting and showing how they fit together. So it's not like, I just want to clarify that it's not just the project, or like my goal isn't just to turn theology into philosophy, or even to turn philosophy into theology, but kind of uncover the theological truths that are already hidden in philosophy.
Yeah, I think that's a good answer. I mean, I wasn't necessarily like trying to state my position, because actually I don't have a position on this necessarily, because I always do this. I do this all the time with like the videos that I do, where um, because I can't mend the language necessarily, I would say, from a theological point of view, there's like this truth that has always been there that has kind of gotten lost within the progressive age, that actually, when we look at it more closely, it has real consequences for not taking it seriously.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and I think there is both. I think both sides should always take each other seriously, which this is what I love about what you're doing, is that you are taking both seriously. I often find that, like you find, most people don't take each other seriously on both sides. Theology and philosophy conversations, but I think when we talk about Nietzsche, for example, the idea that God is dead is a real concept that, if I were to reject God or reject the metaphysical paradigm, I would have to really take that paradigm seriously to kind of work through it if I want to just uh, kind of go past it. Um, but yeah, so my next question is, how is there room for psychoanalysis in Christianity?
Absolutely, yeah. There definitely is. And I'll just name one person who I know is actually a former Lacanian psychoanalyst who converted to Orthodoxy. I know you know about him because I saw you tweet about him, Father Nikolaos Ludovicos. He is a former Lacanian psychoanalyst, and he has written multiple books on Orthodoxy, but also on philosophy as well, although it's always through a theological lens. The one book that's really really important in this regard is analogical identities. So I suggest everyone. I know I'm pretty sure you quoted a pass or a quote from that book, right, on your Twitter.
Yeah, yeah. I heard you talk about it, analogical identities. So I decided to look it up, and then I also heard of the other guy you recommended to me, Seraph Hamilton, right?
Mm, yeah.
He also talked about him, and I was like, cool.
Seraphim talked about him.
I think so. I could be wrong.
You might be thinking of James Cortides. Are you thinking of
Okay.
him?
Okay. Yeah.
I don't know. He actually has 2 interviews with Father Ludovicos. So if you haven't listened to those, I suggest it. He has the first one was actually on analogical identities. They were talking about that, and the most recent one from a few days ago was on the Eucharistic. His book on Eucharistic ontology. But yeah, just to get back to your original question, I think the most important thing about psychoanalysis is that it kind of shows how in Christianity what we'd call the fall into disorder, into imperfection, into disunity, that that ultimately goes into like it's ultimately it's not just yourself isn't free from that. There is no your own psyche isn't free from these effects, all the way down to the deepest levels of subjectivity. You can point out the traces of the fall. So that would be the Christian reading of it. So stuff like Lacanian stuff on desire, for example, it's obviously very complex, and I do not understand. I haven't even read Lacan, but just like the basic idea that you nothing in this world will ultimately satisfy your desire in the most simplified sense, right? That is such a profoundly Christian idea that it's I think it would be a sin not to point it out, even if you weren't Christian. That okay, yeah, Christianity already acknowledges this, although we have a way out, and that's one of the big things. That would be the big disagreement with between me and all of the people that I engage with, like Zizek and Todd McGowan, all those guys, and Lacan. Ultimately, there is no escape from this fallen world. And I like Zizek because he even calls it the fallen world. He points out the similarities between the fall and uh, and the stuff he talks about in terms of subjectivity and our desire. So I would say the biggest takeaway from psychoanalysis from a Christian perspective is that it shows how deep the fall actually was, and in a way that like they have truly genuine insights that we can say that they didn't have before psychoanalysis. I mean, Christianity has been enriched by psychoanalysis, and I think we shouldn't see it as a threat ultimately, because it truly does point back towards um, traditional Christian notions, and only enriches them.
Yeah. Yeah. I like their point there. I even, I've been reading a William James, Varieties of Religious Experience. And I think he made such a simple, good point that made me think about psychoanalysis, where he basically said that logically it's consistent. It would be logically consistent to say that if we were to look at the subconscious, to say that a divine agency put it there, as a way, as a sort of medium to communicate messages between us, which I find fascinating, because if we, really take the idea of the unconscious seriously, we, I mean, even Freud and Jung were perplexed about the unconscious being so deep and so um, just so complicated, that I think there is room, just on that simple basis alone, for Christianity to explore. Even the maxim of, to know yourself is to know God, or to know God is to know yourself. These sort of maxims
Right.
interchange. I think psychoanalysis really tries to emphasize that, to know
For sure.
yourself. And I think psychology, the other versions of psychology where it's aimed today, it's okay, buddy. The other versions of psychology is, I think they're trying to aim at that, but I'm not, I'm typically skeptical about exactly what are we trying to aim when we, when we say that we want to know ourselves.
Right.
I think the picture's missing if you're saying that you're trying to know yourself and you're not you're trying not to involve the other. you
Absolutely. Yeah,
know
for sure.
that's like the paradox. It's like, and I drove myself crazy. Just from my own experience, I drove myself crazy from just reading Jungian psychology of like trying to find myself, uncover my shadow self and all this stuff. And I really came to this abrupt end where I had nothing. There was nothing.
Right, and that would be sort of the more Zizekian idea that I do think definitely has merit, especially as a critique of someone like Jung, where I know Zizek has himself, and I'm sure Lacan is the same, where they have an issue with this idea of knowing yourself, really, even though like they obviously want to expose our hidden presuppositions, the ideological traps we get into, but at the same time, I remember a clip of Zizek where he was talking about this idea of knowing yourself, and he's like, I don't want to know myself, I'm a piece of shit, right? I don't want to know myself. And I guess a more Jungian idea would, yet knowing yourself, becoming reconciled with that. But for Zizek, there really is no self to be known. And you made such a good point about the knowing yourself is knowing God or whatever. And I would take this to a literal, I've very recently been thinking about this, like very literally in Orthodox Christianity. I would say probably Catholicism as well. There's an idea that everything in existence is in some way participating within the mind of God. It is part of God, even though you can't identify it with God in his essence. There's something that Maximus the Confessor talks about, the logi, and the logi are the created archetypes of everything in the mind of God. I think there's created and uncreated logi. I'm really not well read on Maximus, but from what I know, it's that literally everything in existence, every creature, every created thing exists within the mind of God in some way. So when we're saying, and I think there's it's a mistake that Christians, starting from Descartes, probably even before that, Father Ludovicos actually has talked about how it began with Saint Augustine and his Platonist, Neoplatonist framework he was working within. It's the idea that somehow yourself as the I, is somehow not this private sphere where God can't go, where this is just me and I am an individual. But if we accept that literally every single created thing is a something within the mind of God, a logi within the mind of God, to know yourself is to know God in a certain sense. Knowing anything is a knowledge of God. So I don't know if it's been said before, but what I like, just to put it down in a like one sentence, this came to me like two days ago. It's that identity is revelation. Your identity is revealed to you, and that's like kind of like we typically think of revelation in, you're already presupposing the self-identical subject. You're already presupposing the subject who has knowledge revealed to you. But how did you get that subject in the first place? The subject itself is revealed. The subject is something within God. So literally, to know yourself, you need to know God at the most fundamental level. And that's why something like that's where we can problematize something like Cartesianism, when we're saying, and I don't think it's no coincidence, I've pointed this out before, that to say, when Descartes says, I think, therefore I am, he is literally taking the biblical name for God, I am, that I am, and replacing it with man in a way. So we're literally saying that the subject is the I am, but for us, God is the I am. So we can't even really presuppose this subject before God. The subject itself is a revelation of God, and your very self-identity is revealed. And for me, that would be like the most fundamental level of this idea, that to know yourself is to know God, is that literally you as subject, as the I, is a logi in the mind of God.
Yeah. Yeah, wonderfully said. I mean, because a lot of my work recently, I've been doing a lot of reading on like perennial philosophy, and I do a lot of reading from Ibn Arabi and stuff. But some of
Nice.
the things that fascinate me is I am fascinated by the concept of predisposition,
Mhm.
because I think predisposition, if we take predisposition seriously enough, we'd understand that we are not a pure subject.
Mhm.
Um, and that when God says "I am" in the Yahweh version, right? I speculated that God is the only pure subjectivity, and that the paradox is he is, because he is such a pure subjectivity, he is also at the same time the most pure objectivity.
Right.
Um, and that as subjects, right, we're always at most partial subjects, and we are partial subjects because of something that you had said earlier in one of your videos, is that because we can be objective, we have the capacity to be objective, but at best we're always partially subjective and partial subjects, because of this. But I think the paradox that people, and some like note of caution that I always try to tell people when we get caught up in this idea of like trying to find ourselves and trying to know God, is that ultimately, when you want to know God, a lot of the religious practices are aimed at annihilating the ego. And this is something that is so fundamental that people get caught up on the specifics of the commandments themselves. The specifics of the commandments are a problem because the ego finds it a problem. It's disturbing because the ego wants to keep itself in a container of comfort and have that desire. Um, it wants to have the desire and have God. And actually, this is some of the critiques that Aldous Huxley aims at Christianity, and why it failed is because there are so many people throughout history that were Christians that try to lay claim to their desire and God at the same time. And you just can't do that. You can't hold on to your ego desires and God. You have to eradicate one or the other, which is a kind of very interesting thing. And that's why I'm like very hopeful in Christianity in terms of its, revival and kind of like reawakening. And it's ironic because I do feel it's reawakening when I see your channel and other Orthodox Christian channels. I'm not It's funny because I just came back to Christianity, but I'm like in the middle realm where I haven't decided what denomination I'm going to be.
Right.
Um, right now, it's, gone down to Catholicism or Orthodoxy. I was born Seventh day Adventist Christian, but I didn't know anything about it. I didn't know anything about I was just a nominal Christian at best.
Right.
Um, but yeah, so this just to kind of share with you some of like Ibn Arabi's concept of the self, and it would be similar to what you're saying, is that basically the man has to become this mirror where you purify essentially your ego to be this mirror-like thing where God can see himself through the object subject kind of thing. And because of this purification of the mirror, you actually encompass one of God's like divine names.
Mhm.
And essentially this is you becoming your true self.
Right.
Um and what I love about his concept is that it maintains a difference and sameness, right? Because you'd understand that in the purification of the ego with the reflection of God, um, that you actually become a perfect man by attaining one of God's attributes, one of his names. And it's basically catered to your predisposition already. You just have to sort of, unlock it. Um, and everybody has this. Everybody has a certain degree and names. And this is what I love about, holding this sameness and difference. Um, yeah. What's your thoughts on that?
That's interesting. I really like that idea of like encompassing or sort of identifying with a name of God. I'll have to look more into that. Maybe you could send me the relevant stuff after the stream on that. And I guess what I'd say is like I think for Christianity, the biggest advantage it has when trying to think of the self and the other and stuff is our idea of God as Trinity, and everything ultimately is derived from and patterns. Everything that follows the logos follows a sort of Trinitarian pattern. Everything being is communion. That's an Orthodox phrase from from all the church fathers, really, the Eastern ones, but also a book was written by Metropolitan Jean Zazoulas called Being as Communion, where being itself is communion, and that's because God, as the source, the fountain of the highest form of being, is Trinity. And by that, it doesn't mean that it actually, you used the term pure subjectivity earlier, and pure subjectivity is the phrase that Father Dumitru Staniloi, an Orthodox theologian, a brilliant writer, Romanian Orthodox man from the 20th century. That's the term he used to describe the Trinity, and it's a pure subjectivity precisely because it's not like the Aristotelian and the Islamic notions of God as a pure I thinking itself, because this has no content. In order to have content, in order to be objective in a way, there has to be a plurality of subjects. There has to be communion. So he even says that you can't even call the Trinity a single I. The Trinity is three I's in one, and it's this very threeness that makes it one. And he understands this in the sense that to be the Father, part of the I-ness of the Father, this constitutes the unity of the Trinity. To be the I-ness of the Father, included within this I is the Son, is knowledge of and love of the Son as the image of the Father, and the Spirit as well. So the I remains distinct of the Father, yet the I of the Father remains distinct, yet the I-ness of the Son and the Spirit is fully internal to it, so that it still remains distinct, yet there's a perfect unity. And this is what Staniloi calls pure subjectivity. And I think the human is the same, in the same sense that you cannot this is something I just realized, really, that I've been trying to determine what the subject is as the I, but I've been thinking in terms of I equals I, but that's not how the Christian and Trinitarian understanding of subjectivity works. Self-identity, I still think we can speak of self-identity if we need to be clear about what we mean here when we say that self-identity isn't self-relating. So self-identity is communion. You have identity in and through otherness. So I think that the subject itself, as you said, can only be understood in relation to the other. So as I was saying before, I think in terms of subjectivity, we need to understand that we are created archetypes or created things in the mind of God. And this is how we can understand ourselves in knowing the other, because we are constituted in and through the other. We have no existence outside of the other. And so I think that I believe the person you mentioned is an Islamic writer. That is that's a brilliant point. But I would also say that I would say the Christian paradigm has the best. We have the best framework for understanding this necessity of the other, because God himself is a quote unquote other to himself, not in the sense of otherness as negativity or something we can't grasp, but an otherness that is so perfectly united in their otherness that they can be three persons and yet one God. So I would just emphasize the Trinitarian element here, and the fact that from a Christian perspective, if we want to understand anything, but especially mankind as the image of God, we need to understand it in terms of the Trinity.
Yeah, I think so. That was one of the things I used to struggle with when I used to be Muslim, was that a lot of the arguments against Christianity was the basic claim that oh, Christianity doesn't, they believe in God, but they have this, weird notion. They actually believe in three gods because of the Trinity and so on. But after I studied the Trinity for a while, what I realized, the problem of thinking, I realized that there's a big problem in thinking this, and I see philosophers kind of running into this as well, is that it's hard for us to think of opposites or distinctions without negation. We cannot, and it's so funny to me because it's like, you can say, okay, the Father and the Son, they're completely opposite from each other, but they don't negate each other. And that is a very hard concept for people to kind of wrap their mind around, because instantly we want to negate through the opposite.
Mm-hmm.
We always want to negate through the opposite. And that's what I love about the Trinity, is that the Trinity doesn't do that. It's actually a very complex metaphysical system in terms of like, look, you can have difference, but you can have difference without negation.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what's beautiful about it. And so it maintains this wonderful balance between transcendence and immanence. Now, unfortunately for Islam, their theological paradigm actually is basically fully transcendent, and that's the problem. But it gets balanced with the esoteric side of Islam, which is what people have a problem with. And that's like, in my opinion, when I was reading a little bit of Schuon's works about the transcendent unity of all religions, he made a very good point about Christianity that I didn't realize. And this is why Islam and maybe other religions might have a problem with Christianity, is that actually the way Schuon describes Christianity is that Christianity has a apparent esoteric principle. It's not hidden. It's actually very apparent. It's manifest. When you study all the other religions, Islam, Judaism, they all have these hidden esoteric principles that you'd have to study and learn, which I've been doing because I've been doing like my work on perennialism. But Christianity has this. This is the part where I fell in love, is that the esoteric principle is just manifest. And this is what pisses people off, because now Christianity doesn't have a negative theology. It's already included in it. And that's why you don't need like a separate category. Like for Islam, there's Sufism, and, for Judaism, there's the Kabbalah and all this other stuff, right? But for Christianity, it's already included. It's manifest. You just have to say, like the Jesus prayer, and like keep that routine, and do the sacraments, and it's already included. So that's one point that I'd like to make, because I noticed that a lot of people have a problem with, like, Islam. This is the part that I think I wish people knew more, and Muslims themselves, is that there's going to be a problem if you have a fully transcendent God. And I think that actually leads to a type of extremism. And this is why I study Ibn Arabi, because Ibn Arabi makes it very clear with his kind of like some of like heretical views that most Muslims would actually reject what Ibn Arabi is saying, believe it or not, because his interpretation of Noah, Trey, is crazy. He's basically said that the sinners of the Noah's Ark that got flooded away, they were people that believed in the extreme immanence of God, and Noah was the person that he believed in the extreme transcendence of God. So he was saying that actually none of them were right or wrong. It's just that if Noah had only basically said his message to the people where he was holding both the transcendent and the immanent. And I found that a very interesting point of this holding of the transcendence and the immanence. I don't know if you want to make a comment.
Yeah, that's interesting. I've never heard that interpretation of Noah before, but I feel like that's kind of a conclusion you would come to if you can't really think transcendence and immanence at this simultaneously, or like through each other. Like it's not that's not that the Trinity is one and three. It is one in three. The unity is made. You can only have the unity because of the distinction. And I was gonna make a point. Just lost my train of thought. Yeah, about that was such a good point you made about the esotericism. And like one thing that you can say to someone who is more interested in the esoteric side of stuff, it's that it's not that there isn't something deeper in Christianity that you can keep going down and down and down to more and more levels of depth. And that's because this actually sort of relates to an Orthodox understanding. And this is one of the main reasons why theologically I chose Orthodoxy over Catholicism, is that in Catholicism there's a beatific vision, from my understanding, where you behold the essence of God. But for Christianity, we never ever will behold the essence of God. We will commune with his energies in an ever deepening state of what Maximus the Confessor and St. Gregory, I believe the theologian, calls an ever moving rest or perpetual progress. We're perpetually getting deeper into the life of God for infinity, precisely because God's essence is beyond all understanding and grasping. So we'll always have more and more to enter into. And the point though is that even the most simple form of Christianity, like just the Nicene Creed, you can be a Christian and only understand the most basic doctrines of Christianity. You can and live your Christian life, prayer, participate in the sacraments, and you will fundamentally understand, or you will be just as Christian as the person who has gone deep into the depths of the connections in the Bible and the richness of theology, precisely because the truth is both absolutely simple, is both very simple and complex at the same time. There's a unity here. The complexity is only revealing what is already within the simple formulas in a non-explicit way. So there is no division between the exoteric and the esoteric, in the sense that you cannot, for us, the exoteric already implies the esoteric, and it just needs to be revealed as already being there. So the infinite depths of Christ is present in the sacrament of the Eucharist, and we will never understand the depth of this sacrament and what actually is there. But when we say this is the body of Christ, that is fundamentally correct. You're 100%. You have fully understood what that is. That it is the body of Christ, just in those simple words. So yeah, I just wanted to point out that this idea of, in Christianity, that there's not an esoteric and exoteric divide, it doesn't mean that there isn't unknown mysteries to be found in the Christian faith, and that there isn't a deep, richness to be discovered. It's just that this richness is already within the core tenets of the faith, and it's not like some secret knowledge that the average person doesn't already have, because ultimately what all you're discovering when you go deeper and deeper, all you're discovering is more things about the Trinity. But if you already have the Trinity, you already have everything you're going to need.
Yeah, it's one of those things that it's some of my works on perennialism is actually kind of funny. It's probably antithetical to a lot of like what original perennial philosophy has been saying. But the way I like to say it is this, and it kind of goes well with the division between exoteric and esoteric, is that it's best, depending on how you look at it, it's best to experientially approach them separately, but kind of like big picture frame, they're not separate. And this kind of prevents, like, so basically the real work is you need to make you go through the exterior and you make the interior so translucent that you can't even tell the difference between the inside and the outside anymore. That is like really that is, I could say, from a Christian point of view, right? That is the demand of like the imitation of Christ, right? That is to make
Right.
everything so translucent from the inside and out that you can't even make the divide.
And
You can't.
isn't that what? Sorry to interrupt, but isn't that exactly what Saint Paul says when he says that God will be all in all in the final days, in the eschaton? That is the moment when the transcendent is unified with his creation perfectly, right? It's God is all in all. So just as you're saying, you can't even tell the difference between the inside and the outside because it's so perfectly united.
Yeah, and so what I think what has really stuck with me with perennialism is that, most of the arguments against perennialism is that this difference is what's going to you're denying difference if you sort of accept perennialism. But a lot of the perennial philosophers have, said that this is not true. It is basically this provocation, at least the way I interpret this, is this provocation that if you take the external sacraments seriously as a means,
Mm-hmm.
you will find this so-called claimed truth as such. Um, and again, this kind of has to go back with the predispositions that I'm very fascinated about. Um, and why is it that, I think somebody said, why is it that a Buddhist, if there is a transcendent unity, why doesn't a Buddhist like switch to another religion, right? Why doesn't he, if he knows that it's all the same?
Right.
And I thought that was a beautiful question, but I thought that it would have to do with this idea of a multiplicity of perfect men, a multiplicity of men taking on God's divine names. Um, and that's it's almost like, and again, I think there is, and this is why I like the Trinity, because the Trinity allows you to see in a very apparent and fundamental way this idea of that multiplicity can be in the one, and it doesn't negate the other.
Mm-hmm.
And I feel like this has actually been my approach to perennialism, but unfortunately, I think a lot of the debate against perennialism is that you're discussing a difference between like exoteric theologies, and I think perennialism is not meant for that. Because fundamentally, it's like, yes, I'd have to admit that Christianity is different from Buddhism. Christianity is different from Islam. The idea of salvation is completely different. Um, so on those levels, I feel like we can't. There's no reconciliation at that point. But
Mm-hmm.
actually, Schumann said something very kind of provocative to me when he said that actually it's because of this it's the fact that we can't reconcile the external properties of every religion that proves the superiority of the inside, the
Mm-hmm.
underlying aspect of all of them. But again, the problem is that I'm not a saint. I'm not a mystic. So I cannot even
Right.
begin to be like, yeah, this is totally true, Trey. We should all just accept it. In fact, actually, my notions of perennialism right now is that I think it's true, but I actually think that people should reject it because it is true. It's that kind of like paradox where it is best to accept that it's not true and separate it from that, because there's lots of problems, in my opinion, if someone blindly accepts this universalism. And that's what I don't want to happen. I don't want somebody to
Mm-hmm.
just accept a blind universalism and just start going around going, well, hey, doesn't matter, man. All religions are the same, which it's missing the point.
For sure. Yeah, I haven't read as much perennialism as I should. I've only read like back in the day, I read Julius Evola, so that's all I've really read. But it makes me think about how, like, this idea that there's an overarching unity beyond the external, I guess, contingencies, we could call them. For one, that's sort of a Gnostic idea, that deep within you, for example, within the interior of yourself, there's the truth. And then all these external forms are ultimately, we're only just trying to get back to what's inside, like the deep spark of the divine, or whatever, the truth within you. So that's one thing I'd say. And also, I think the perennialist philosophy, fundamentally, the way of seeing religions, the problem is that I think it sort of does work with the Eastern stuff. Like the Eastern uh, religions, if you want to call them that, like Buddhism, they're already sort of perennialistic. Like, there already is that idea of the multiple paths to the one truth, the universal truth that different religions embody in their own way. But for us, I would say this already presupposes that Christianity isn't true, for the reason that we consider truth to be a person. Truth isn't just some impersonal form or whatever beyond everything that everything participates with in their own way. Truth is literally a person. It's literally the logos of God. That is the truth. So in a way, perennialism is right in the sense that other religions have aspects of the logos, and Orthodoxy is written, like we've written about this. There's a book, Christ the Eternal Tao. That's a book that talks about the Tao and how it relates to Christ and the logos and stuff. So, and ultimately, from a biblical perspective, all of these religions descend from the line of Noah, who had the true God revealed to him. That's why, for me, it's no coincidence that the highest God in the pantheon of basically every religion is associated with the sky in some way, because we know from Genesis that while the covenant name of God for the Jews was Yahweh, the name of God that was established for the Gentiles in the Noachic covenant was the Most High God, El Elyon. So God is associated with the sky in the Americas, in China, in Africa, in Australia, in Europe, because this is all the same revelation of the one God. So even from a biblical perspective, there is merit to perennialism, in the sense that these religions embody the logos in a way. But I think from a Christian perspective, we would just say that because the truth is a person, we have a sort of monopoly on truth, because we are following that person. We are the followers of Christ. We are Christians. So, and actually, Saint Justin Martyr, he's a very, very early apostolic father, I believe from the 2nd century. He talks about how everyone from all nations who follows the logos, they are a follower of Christ, whether they believe it or not. And he explicitly mentions Heraclitus and Socrates as two men before Christ who didn't know Christ, who were following the logos in their own way. So there is a universal dimension to the logos, but this universality is fully revealed in the one person of Christ, because he is the incarnate word. So, I think there's a lot of interesting stuff about perennialism, whether it be from the more philosophical side of all of us participating in the logos in some way, and also even just from the historical side in terms of the transmission. Like, I know I'm personally, I believe the Genesis narrative, in the sense that I do believe there was an actual man named Noah who is the father of all nations. So even from a historical side, there's a lot of interesting stuff there as well.
Yeah, I think I've noticed this is because what is it? The thing that used to drive me crazy about when I was exploring all these religions is that fundamentally everybody claimed to have a monopoly on the truth. And I have been always like trying to think through this multiplicity of claiming monopoly on the truth. And at a certain point, it kind of drove me crazy a little bit, just because if you keep exploring enough, you come into like a multiplicity of problems. For example, like if I accept Christianity, right, I still got to find out which denomination is true, and then the problem with on top of that is that everybody has this certain standard and criteria for what they would deem as the correct interpretation, the correct perspective to sort of look at it. Um, even the way of like interpreting the Bible, right? Or, for example, when I was a Muslim, a lot of it was based off of like, you know, did these people, were they virtuous? Did they have a sort of a lineage of people saying the same things? And that way we can build credibility. Um, Again, this is a sort of constructed criteria to sort of base truth on. Um, and so I think for me the problem was I found it sort of like unsolvable to a certain point where I could always come across a rebuttal from another person on each side, uh, and for me it just kind of seemed like endless amount of rebuttals. Um, I've even been watching a lot of like Catholicism and Orthodoxy kind of like things, and um, I think for me, it's sort of it's even sometimes like distracting, where it's like I just want to have a relationship with God, not necessarily get
Right.
in the entanglements of like high theology.
Right.
Um, but yeah, I've noticed that the Christian perspective is always very adamant about the personal God, and where the like Buddhism is probably like the most atheistic notion of it. But I do find, and this is where like my work on predisposition has been kind of more provocative to me, where even when I look at Catholicism, right, the big debate between Orthodoxy and Catholicism is the papacy. That's like one of the biggest problems, right?
Hmm.
But I
Yep.
started thinking about this, like, if we just think about this from a predisposition point, I asked myself, what if people like Catholicism because they just like the comfort of this authority and one united interpretation,
Hmm.
where they can just live in the comfort of like, look, everything is kind of like handed to me, everything is written out. We don't really have too much debate about it because there's the authority, we have the papacy, stuff like that. Orthodoxy, however, we don't have anybody, necessarily dictating. We can have a more democratic point of view. We'd have a more uniform interpretation, but there's room for debate and discussion. But of course, I think for some people that would cause some, you know, doubt, hesitancy, and again, it's for both sides. I think when I hear people talk about the papacy, they're like, I don't like the idea of someone being in charge, dictating, and so on. So I feel I don't want to reduce it to personal preferences, because I don't think that would be the right way to do it. But I do think there is something to the predisposition that kind of gets pulled to certain criteria of truth, where when Catholicism claims this type of papacy, a type of authority, some people are like, yes, I want that, without explicitly
Right.
saying that they want that.
Hmm.
um, because when I started learning about Catholicism and Orthodoxy, my first instinct was, I was like, no, I don't want some type of head pope dictating everything.
Hmm.
um, I was like, I rather want orthodoxy.
Hmm.
Um, but then I just reflecting on my experience of this kind of instinctual pulling away of having this sort of like authority. It's been really interesting to think about, even when I kind of consider, um, Buddhism and Hinduism and all their type of attributes. I'm like, okay, what type of predisposition would allow somebody to, maybe it's like, for example, Buddhism has this very atheistic notion. I think that actually, for some people, it might be too much to even think about God. It'd actually do them more harm to consider God, think about God, um, where Buddhism automatically tells you to just don't think about those questions.
Mm-hmm.
You're just focused on this sort of inner experience and achieving, a type of enlightenment. One of my favorite things from Buddha was like the guy was dying and he said, "Is there God?" And Buddha said, "Why do you want me to answer that question when you are already dying from 3 poison arrows in your heart? Right? Why don't you pay attention?" He basically saying, "Why don't you pay attention to the 3 poison arrows in your heart rather than asking me if there is a divine?"
Mm.
Which, again, it started making me speculate about this sort of, because I personally make a divide between there is the truth, and then there's people that are not ready to sort of handle the fullness of the truth. And I think this is an argument that Schuon makes where I do believe that religions have a hold on the truth. Is just that when we come in contact in the fullness of the truth, is that for most people that is too much to bear. We would essentially become annihilated in the face of the fullness of the truth. And I think the external aspects of religions are a sort of way to ease the common people in towards a face of the truth where the whole job is that hopefully eventually we can sort of, through the means of these external practices, reach some type of contact with the fullness of the truth. Um, yeah, that's I went long about that one, but yeah.
No, that was nice. And uh, I'll just point out that from an Orthodox perspective, these external rituals, right? They're not just, especially when it comes to like the sacraments, because we actually believe they're divinely, they're infused with divine grace, and they are the specific. Like you can imagine it, like like in the Avengers movie where they open the portals, right? You can imagine the sacraments like the portals of eternity. This is the way in which eternity is brought to creation, right? So these rituals in Christianity, when you're talking about the fullness of the truth, that's definitely true that we aren't prepared for it for sure. And that's the point of the sacraments, and that's the point of purification. It's not just your mind being made ready. Like the rituals are literally, there is an you obviously know what like deification and theosis is, right? So you are literally being deified and purified by the grace of God in in order to be prepared to behold the fullness of God. And this is something obviously C.S. Lewis sort of is working with in The Great Divorce. It's the fact that you can be, even when you're so deep into sin, even when you're so deep into yourself, ultimately, there's still a chance, unless you've been obviously eternally damned, there is this chance always to turn back towards God. So purification is really preparing to behold the fullness of the truth. And you're definitely right that the purpose of these external rituals is to do that. Like even in the Old Testament, like the Holy of Holies in the Old Testament, this is where God dwelled. Now the Holy of Holies is the Eucharist. It's in the church. In the end times, the Holy of Holies will be every single particle in existence, every single area in existence. God will be there. He will be dwelling there. And the reason he's not dwelling there is that if he were to dwell in our fallen creation, he would destroy it just by the very ontological nature of what God is and what sin is, what imperfection is. Imperfection and God just don't go together. It just doesn't work like that. So the Old Testament rituals, there's a story, I'm ashamed I don't know what book it's from. Some guy touches the Holy of Holies by accident, and he hasn't been purified, and he dies. Seraphim Hamilton points out that this guy is probably in heaven. He was a right-believing Jew. He made a mistake, right? He believed in the one God. So he's probably in heaven. So why did he die? He died because of what he is, and because of what the Holy of Holies was, or because of what the Ark of the Covenant was. They just didn't go together. So this kind of actually leads to the Orthodox and even Catholic, I would say, understanding of death and why we died. It wasn't just to take a, like the way the Protestants would usually talk about it, is that death, the fall was a moral evil that required a moral punishment because of the justice of God. And of course, God is just, but at the same time, like there is not a fair relationship between God and us. It's not like we're giving him enough to justify getting what we receive from God, because we receive everything from God. It's a completely symmetrical relationship here. But death is just the product of turning away from the source of life. It is an ontological. So really, the whole difference between the Protestant understanding of the fall and the Catholic and Orthodox view is that the Protestants see it as primarily a moral transgression of the commandment of God. But for us, it obviously was morally incorrect. It was a moral transgression, but more fundamentally, it was an literal ontological it had ontological significance primarily, in the sense that we are turning away from God and towards death, because death is um, death is the opposite of life. That is just how it works by its very nature. When you reject life, you end up dying. So dying was not just an arbitrary punishment God determined because he's a just God and has to punish sinners. It's that by the very nature of the case, because of what God is and because of what sin is, they just don't go together. So the point of purification of these rituals is making yourself ready in an ontological sense to partake of to behold God and to partake of his divine life without being completely annihilated, like the Jewish man who accidentally touched the Ark of the Covenant.
This always reminds me of like the problem of evil, where I used to think it was a problem for me, like way back then. But I think the way I look at it now is that, like you were talking about, like the justice of God, right? And I think C.S. Lewis actually makes a perfectly, valid argument about it. It's very simple. It's the fact that we have free will, right? It's the very fact that we have free will. Um, and if you really think about it seriously, it's the fact that because we have this free will, no love relationship can exist without this free will. But I think another way that I approach this kind of notion of heaven and hell and justice is that heaven and hell is ultimately in my opinion, like an ego problem. And a lot of saints and mystics at a certain point stop talking about like heaven and hell. They're so like absorbed in the love of God. Hold on. Just gonna get this alarm real quick.
Sure, yeah.
Can you hear that, Trey?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, I can't find it. So.
Yeah,
Okay.
it's not that distracting. It's fine. Oh, I think it stopped. Yeah.
Okay, so yeah, what I was saying is, I think the heaven and hell ultimately is an ego problem, but at the same time, I think when somebody starts their spiritual journey, is that it's best to take them as seriously as possible. It's even best to take it's even best to fear God in the beginning, as you could say, as much as possible. Um, I think one book that really affected me was it was a Christian mystic work. It was the Cloud of Unknowing, and he basically makes this climb where you have to, before you're even ready for contemplation, you have to already be like active, in the church and doing sacraments and doing your prayers, like all the external things.
Hmm.
And once you have gotten this prepared, prepared yourself, then you can sort of begin the contemplative life. But even the contemplative life is still predicated on your predisposition. Like, are you really called for the contemplative life? So that's why I always say, like, in my opinion, like heaven and hell, even though for me they should be taken seriously, even as ontological realities. But I think in the broad scope of things, is that fundamentally you return to God, um, and that either heaven or hell is that, in a way, it's like either you do the purification yourself, which is already hell like in nature, um, or you become forced to do the purification, which
Right.
is through hell. So that's why I found the line that I read in the Perennial Philosophy, where it said that both heaven and hell are safe passages to God, um, because I really do think that when you are trying to sort of purify yourself already here in reality, is that it's miserable. I mean, and the crazy thing about God is that the more you get closer to God, there is this paradox that happens where you fundamentally get more light in through your faults. You start to see your faults
Yep.
way more clearly, and you get to see yourself way more wretched than you had seen yourself ever before. And that's
Yes.
the paradox that most people I don't think they realize, and that's sort of like the paradox with self righteousness, where you, even if you think you're kind of like on the right path, you can always get caught up in these traps, these little deceptions along the way, which I love about St. John of the Cross in one of his books. I think The Dark Night of the Soul, like every single path climbing was like a problem that you had to overcome,
Yep.
specifically in your spiritual journey. Um, yeah, I think my follow-up question for you is like, how, like, do you, because I watch Capturing Christianity.
Hmm.
I love his channel, but I think for me was I I'm just kind of curious on your take. Like, what's your notion of like the problem of evil? Do you think it's like as big of a problem for you? Do you think like, you know like what's your kind of like view on that?
Um, I don't think it's a big problem for me. And I think that's just because the way I was introduced to Christianity, I wasn't even thinking about the problem of evil before I had, uh, but before I was like completely immersed in Orthodoxy, because I think Orthodoxy really is uh, the best counter to the problem of evil, especially the way Seraphim Hamilton put it, because he was really my introduction to Orthodoxy, in a serious way. And it's that, um, for one, God does not create evil, so the evil itself does not originate in God. And really, to understand this, you need to remember that God is communion and being is communion. So, how can something exist yet not exist and not be a part of God? Because there clearly is evil. And I've sort of the best way I've come to think about it is as self-relation. So evil is self-relation, and goodness and being itself is communion. Now, self-relation literally doesn't exist. Like, think about, um, in order to have any sort of thing, you already need to have communion. You already need to have a distinction, and they're, in some way, interacted with each other. but to have a pure self-relation, that is what Hegel calls pure indeterminate being. Now, pure indeterminate being is nothing. So I think Hegel's already done the work for us when we're saying that if you're trying to think of being outside of communion, you're thinking of nothing. And what is sin? What is evil? Evil is nothing. So pure self-relation is evil, is nothing. And then goodness is communion. Now, at the same time, so that's sort of how I would understand evil itself. It's not that evil is something like you have this idea of the devil and you're going to some substantial evil. No, there is no evil. Ultimately, it is for one, I would say idolatry is improper relations. So it's a relation that is not complete, not hell in the sense of, because I'd also emphasize that the sin itself is hell. Like hell isn't. I don't think we can I don't think we can separate the punishment from the act itself. There is, insofar as we haven't reached hell yet, there is a divide here, but I would say hell itself is the place where the punishment and the act itself become one. Just the very fact of existing in your state, that is the punishment. So I would say, for one, it was this idea of evil not as substantial that really helped me thinking of the problem of evil. But then something like, so just very, very simple question: why would God allow a tsunami to kill thousands of innocent men, women, and children? Well, ultimately, I think it does come down to a sort of mystery to God's creation and his providence, not knowing. But at the same time, you have in Orthodoxy, it's really stressed that man is the microcosm of creation, and it was through man that sin entered the world and there was destruction. So the natural world itself is, for one, under the dominion of the devil, who is obviously under the providence of God. He is not outside of it, but still, the world itself is under the dominion of Satan, or was until Christ, but his influence is still here in a way. And it's man's actions. It was through man that sin entered into the world. It was through man that this disharmony came between creation and the world happened, because man is the microcosm connecting heaven and creation. And that is in a very, very literal sense. It's like, how did the divine come into the world? It was through a man. It was through Christ. It's not. It's like, that is why Christ became a man. That is why man is the image of God, because man is the mediator between heaven and hell. Heaven and creation, and then Jesus is the perfect mediator. He is the mediator because he is perfectly God and man at the same time. So some people have an issue with Christ being, like, when Christians say that Christ will be in human form for the rest of time. But that's like having an issue with someone living in their own house until they die. It's like someone who perfectly built this house that they love. Like, to an even greater extent, God made man to be his image. He made man perfect, and like, his plan was to unite with mankind, and it's through mankind that all of creation is either glorified or becomes corrupted. So one of the big things that I think many Protestants probably just have a hard time accepting, and it may lead to, I'm not sure, I'm sure it does lead some very rational people into apostasy, is the idea that God is just controlling everyone. There's no free will, and everyone dying in all of these natural disasters that seem so unnecessary. This is all just God choosing for that to happen. When in reality, God made the world in a certain way so that our free actions truly do influence the world. And beyond that, there are good and evil angelic powers that are exerting influence on creation. So it's by understanding it in this way that you can see how all of this evil stuff happens, even to even to innocence, and ultimately the everything that occurs in the world will be made perfect in the end. It will all be shown to be a part of God's plan in the end, because Christ is the victor in history. So I think that's sort of the lesson of the book of Job, is that there's very bad readings of the book of Job, and I'm not an expert on it at all, but fundamentally the lesson is very simple. It's that God glorifies through or God glorifies through even using the devil, even using misery, because it's been introduced into creation against the will of God. But he will use this in order to ultimately uh in order for his will to be done. So there's something in Job, I wish I knew the details of it, but he began with like a certain amount of children and a certain amount of animals, and by the end of the book they've literally doubled. So the point is that he went through all of this, but in the end he got even more than he had before. So the lesson from that is that all our spiritual trials, all the misery we go through, is ultimately directed towards the end if we align ourselves with the will of God towards towards our own glorification and our own salvation.
Yeah, you know, I heard one explanation of this that I'm not sure if it would have been helpful to people, but I think it was helpful for me at the beginning. Was this idea, like I think you're right, right? So when we look at sin and sort of like our egos, what's ironic about sin is that sin itself is non-existent, but you really feel this in the self, because you can feel this as like a void, as like this perpetual void. And the very fact, just to like use Lacan stuff, right? The very fact that there is no satisfaction, um, that our satisfaction is just almost, uh, it, it just can't be satisfied. It's always perpetual. And so this perpetual void of never achieving satisfaction is what my opinion is what I would call like hell. Um, and it's funny because, when we talk about, if we use like light and dark as metaphors, light doesn't necessarily create darkness, right? But it's the fact that light shines that you see darkness around it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
It's just darkness itself is this non-existence. It is this like kind of like void thing. It's just that once light appears, you see the darkness. Um, and this is what I even like about the notion of like the banality of evil from Hannah Arendt, I believe, where you cannot literally fathom all the evil that is going on because it's so perpetually normalized. And I think this is what's useful, for people that are trying to understand sin and so on, is that when you begin, and I almost want to say, if you take like even a empirical experimental approach, right? If you just see experimentally, when you refrain yourself from something, you start to see you have a hard time avoiding it. You have a hard time following through with it. Why is that? Why can't I refrain from, lying? Why can't I refrain from, maybe getting into sort of adulterous relationships? Um, you start to see easily that this notion of sin is very apparent in your life just from the act of trying to refrain from your desire. And it's this very refraining that you start to notice that it has become like a perpetual void in your life, without you having realized it until you began to refrain from it. And this is
Right.
what I love about, and this is why I don't even try to engage in too much theological talk, because in my opinion, it's that the commandments themselves, or any type of spiritual practice, really shows itself it doesn't show itself until you involve yourself in it. And I think a lot of people miss that point. So even like the questions on suffering and so on, I mean, we can try to make sense of this theologically, but I always refrain from it because I just feel like once you start diving yourself in through the experiment, through the just let me try it out and see what I can achieve from this, you might come to an understanding that kind of goes above theology. I think theology sort of appealed to the common people, but it does not always appeal to our temperaments. It doesn't appeal to everybody's, it doesn't appeal to everybody's temperaments. But to kind of add to something else that you said, I think a reversal is sometimes interesting. And I read this from Iqbal. You know, it's not that man should have faith in God, right? But that, you know, God is letting these things happen because God is wanting to have faith in man. Which is I thought was a very interesting reversal where it's like, you know, God is sort of letting some of these things happen, you could say. And it's our responsibility, our kind of like calling to sort of rise to something more above ourselves. Which kind of leads me to some of the other things that you said when you're talking about the reconciliation of contradiction. I'm wondering, I'm gonna propose this to you to see what you think, because I've been thinking about this reconciliation. So I came up with I was reflecting on this, and I said that I think reconciliation is not something that we would necessarily do, but the fact it would be this subtle realization that man himself is the reconciliation, where, you know, we don't, and I think this is like the problem with philosophy, where philosophy has been trying to solve the many and the one for like such a long time. You know, they're trying to do like this sort of theoretical reconciliation. But in my opinion, it's this ironic thing where man is trying to do the reconciliation without realizing that he himself is the reconciliation of the one and the many. It is this Nietzschean calling of being a bridge, that fundamentally we can't reconcile the one and the many because we don't know how to become a bridge between the one and the many. And when we look at the Trinity, the bridge is already like laid down for us. It already shows us how to achieve this reconciliation with the one and the many. It's by literally imitating Christ. So what's your thoughts on that?
That's a really good way to put it. And I guess, okay, this next thing might be a little long, what I'm going to go on, because I want to touch on a few things you said even before, and it's actually related to what you just said. So I just wrote down what you said, so I make sure I get back to it. But first of all, I think this sort of relates to this idea of the point you made about how you don't see the darkness until you have light, right? And this, I think, is expressed in the Christian tradition with this idea of seeing yourself as the worst sinner. This goes back to St. Paul, I believe, in 1 Timothy, I believe. He says, I am the worst sinner, right? And he even says, I've done more than anyone else to spread Christianity, but I'm the worst sinner. So I think that it's easy to see this and just think that this is sort of like a hyperbolic, typical disingenuous Christian piety, right? And I looked in the tradition for this, and there really is from what I found, no really good explanation philosophically in terms of what this means, because it's obviously wrong, right? Obviously, St. Paul is not the worst sinner. And my idea here is that this is just something I've sort of working on, but I don't even fully grasp it yet. So every time I talk about it, I kind of I never say it the right way, but I'm gonna try, because it works in my head every so often. But when I try and talk about it, it just doesn't work. But I think there's a way in which you can say that Paul can say he's the worst sinner, but we can't say Paul is the worst sinner. So Paul can say, I am the worst sinner, but we cannot say Paul is the worst sinner. In the same way, actually, I believe St. Porphyrios talks about this, a 20th century Orthodox saint. He talks about how, or it might have been St. Sophrony, one of the saints talks about how we say, Lord Jesus Christ, have mercy on me, even when we're praying for other people. So he says, it's okay to say, Lord Jesus Christ, have mercy on so-and-so, but you don't add the last part of the Jesus prayer, which is a sinner. We don't ever confess that other people are sinners. And this is actually one thing I will pray the rosary sometimes. And I've actually stopped saying, part of the Hail Mary prayer is pray for us sinners. I've just taken that out and I just say pray for us now. And the reason I think is that it kind of goes back to this idea of being the worst sinner and the fact that we can all be the worst sinners. And this is true in a way, but at the same time, we can't call each other the worst sinners. And I think it kind of goes back to the fact that evil has no logos and it has no being. So there is no objective standard of evil, right? There is no objective substance of evil. Evil is an act of the will of turning away from God. It is the act itself. It has no existence beyond this act. There is no positive substance of evil. So you can't place it within an objective hierarchy because evil has no objectivity. Evil is inherently subjective. It inherently is a product of the subject. So I think when we're saying that I am the worst sinner, for one, we are acknowledging that we only have freedom over ourselves, right? So we have to be the worst sinner because this is where it gets difficult. It's like you can't confess for another person because one, you don't know their heart, and two, this is how evil, this is a crucial part I forgot to talk about. Evil is measured in the Bible by your knowledge of evil. So this is actually a distinction from Plato. I got this from Zizek, actually. He mentioned how in Christianity, they don't say what Plato says, where he says that evil is ignorance, right? So you only commit evil in ignorance. This is a very Hellenic notion. But for Christianity, actually, you are more evil the more knowledge you have of evil, yet you still commit the act. That's why the sin of Adam and Eve was not as serious as the sin of Judas, who turned away from the incarnate God, who sold him for whatever amount he got. That's why Adam and Eve are in heaven and Judas isn't, even though Judas could have repented. But still, I mean, the point is that was a more serious sin because of the knowledge. So since sin has no knowledge and it's inherently part of the will, something the will does, the only objective quote unquote standard to determine whether something is evil is your own knowledge of whether or not it is, because something isn't truly evil unless there is a subject who is committing the evil act and knows it's wrong. That's why we don't say animals are evil. We say animals are disordered, whatever, fallen, right? But they're not evil as such. And that's the uniquely human capacity to be evil. So when we're saying we're the worst sinner, we're sort of acknowledging that sin is only determined by one's knowledge, and we're the only ones with our own knowledge of sin. So we are acknowledging this absolute radical responsibility that we have for our own sin, and the fact that we only have access to our own knowledge in committing the sin. So that's really, it's very like, that's how I would sketch it out for now. It's like I think that this idea of, and it all comes back to this idea of I am the worst sinner. Like, are we just going to dismiss this as some hyperbole, which I don't think is proper, or just some disingenuous piety, or is there an actual truth being said here? And I think there is, and it just has to be, because it's such a core aspect of Christian spirituality. So that's what the paradox is, that as you're becoming purified, as you're seeing the light, you're seeing your own darkness even more clearly, to the point where you can see your own darkness and allow Christ to destroy it with full knowledge, full cooperation of your will. And I think that would be salvation. Now this idea of man as the reconciliation between the one and the many, I think that's fundamentally true, because man is that being who knows we are being. So that's obviously a Heideggerian idea. And what this means fundamentally, if we want to read this in a Christian way and in not a way that is polluted by the sort of Cartesian idea of the singular subject, is that your own knowledge of yourself is a knowledge of God, as we were talking about earlier. So you are to know yourself is to know fundamentally that you are not only one, but you are many. And this is something that no other creature in the world, at least at this time, is able to know. No animal, no plant, obviously, can know that they are one in many. They can only be one in many. But in knowing that we are the one in the many, we are able to have this willful cooperation with the God who is one in many. And that is why self damnation is an inherent. It only happens for beings with free will, and that's because damnation is just, it's a turning away from all things divine in a willful sense. And you were talking about how for you hell and heaven are both paths to see God, and I don't have any problem with that language, even though I'm not a universalist, although I would be if I just can't be because of the tradition of the church. And I've looked into it, and I don't really see a way in which universalism can be defended from an Orthodox perspective, and I want to remain faithful to the church. But there is something to be said about this idea of seeing God. But for us, eternal damnation is seeing God. It's seeing the same light. But because you are turning away into the darkness and not becoming a mirror that is receptive to the light and reflecting it back by giving thanks, and the Eucharist actually means to give thanks, without, and that's something that Adam and Eve didn't do. They failed to give thanks to God, and instead they disobeyed him. Hell is, instead of being able to give thanks back to God and reflect the light, you're turning away to yourself, trying to get everything from yourself by turning away from God. And that, in the sense of the light, is experienced in a negative way, in an unpleasurable way, because that is just the nature of darkness and light. And so all we have to think about is hell is darkness, but in terms of the will. You are choosing eternally to turn away from the light. And when the light does shine, it will be all in all, but that experience of the light will be negative for yourself. And I'm not sure how I sort of even want to say, although I'll preface this by I'm not sure, that even in a way, when you are saved and you're looking upon the damned, I don't know if this happens, but there is a sense in which you will, because the light will be all in all, you will only see light. You will not see stain or darkness. And that this darkness is only a reality for those that are damned. And that from God's perspective, from the true perspective, everything has been made perfect, even with the damned. And so I'm uncertain about that, but I mean, that's what I would say on that.
Actually, you saying that kind of reminds me of this subtle distinction between what Huxley would call in the perennial philosophy survival and complete deliverance. Where survival is basically you're stuck on the paradigms between the two opposites, right? Between heaven and hell. But I think what's interesting is that there is room to where we don't have to negate the concept or the paradigm of heaven and hell, but ultimately realize that there is this complete deliverance, which is above that paradigm, which is the sort of that all light, all perfect kind of notion. And I like that idea of that. And what you had said earlier about, evil has no objectivity. I thought that was so perfect because it's like, you know, we've been trying to come up with a ethical system, right, in just our world for so many years, and it's like we still don't have, everything is reduced to sort of relativity, essentially, right? Relative, everything is relative in this stuff, but I think it is because of this evil has no objectivity.
Hmm.
At best, right, even the way was it C.S. Lewis says it, at best it's a disordered good, right? Like sex in itself is not bad, but it's the way we approach sex that could be evil towards us, right? um God, there was so much good stuff you said, um and it's all slipping from my mind all of a sudden. I was going to add well, it's not coming to my mind.
No worries. Happens
Oh,
to me all the time.
yeah, the reconciliation. Yeah.
Hmm.
Oh, okay. Yeah, the one in the many. Okay.
Hmm.
So I think that's I was gonna comment and talk about the Deleuzian notion of multiplicity, because I think what's wrong with that notion is that you can't affirm multiplicity without without becoming that reconciliation between the one and the multiple. And I think that's actually a huge problem. And I think that's what kind of even leads into the idea that evil has no objectivity. Because if you're stuck in the multiplicity, if you're stuck affirming multiplicity, you have no objective, you could say, standard at all. And everything is reduced to its relativity. Um, and so I thought that was just like really good, like building points on what you had said. Um, because I think that's why it kind of gets hard for people, and they get stuck in this like perpetual cycle of, void and suffering, while affirming multiplicity, and at the same
Hmm.
time not realizing that there is no objective standard, and yet they are implying an objective standard just by the fact that they are trying to affirm this multiplicity. And I think that was what I thought was brilliant about um, C.S. Lewis's like simple argument about morality was that, okay, we can look at there's good and evil, right? But the very fact that you think of good and evil as two paradigms already implies a standard that you are inferring from. And the question is, what is this standard that you are inferring from? And I think the only good answer to that is a theological paradigm.
Right. Yeah.
It can't be answered. In fact, you can't. I feel like you can't even talk about good and evil without trying to address what is that standard that you're referring to.
Hmm.
Uh, if you are so adamant about good and evil, and I think that's why the evil argument always falls short, because you are so passionate about a standard that is not apparent until you accept a theological paradigm.
Hmm.
Um, yeah. And then I think I'll let you comment, and then I have just one like, off the wall question for you,
Sure.
and then we'll wrap up.
Well, I'll just say that I think this is one of the biggest things that Christians need to realize, is that evil has no objective standard. And I think the best way to think about this is in terms of communion and self-relation. So this only came to me recently, so it's going to be something I'm going to be emphasizing much more, is that in Christianity there is communion and there is self-relation. Communion is being, goodness, God, and then self-relation is evil, not a non-being. And if you're thinking in terms of these two categories, everything becomes so much more clear, and like it just, and it is, I think it's just the proper way to think. It's the Trinitarian way to think. And I think it is specifically for my stuff when it comes to Zizek and stuff. I mean, he is the philosopher of self-relating paradoxes. Like, this is what he's dealing with. And I don't even think, like, providentially, it's a coincidence that I read him for like I read Nietzsche and then I read Zizek, and that is really how I got into philosophy. Is that it's like, and it's not just me. It's like in terms of the like the fact that there is clearly a revival of Christianity, and in response to, on the one hand, atheism and scientism, and then there's of course leftism now, and then there's evangelical Christianity. So many people were raised in and are dissatisfied with. There is clearly something going on with Orthodoxy in particular, and I think that it's just so perfect that this is right at the time when in philosophy they're finally encountering these self-relating paradoxes. So that would sort of just be my final word on that, is that the reason that evil has no objectivity is that it is antithetical to communion, because all it is self-relating, and self-relating is non-being fundamentally, as Hegel himself proved. Pure indeterminate being, pure self-relating without any distinction, and therefore no communion, that is nothing. And then that is evil. So evil is nothing understood as self-relation.
Yeah, I think that was wonderfully said. Probably better than I probably could ever approached it. And I like that you use Zizek as this sort of like proof for this self-relating like void that you fall into, right?
Yeah.
And I think that's why I love Zizek too, because always has these like paradoxes that you fall into.
Mm-hmm.
So for the fun question, who do you like more? And I think I would already know the answer, but I'm
Okay.
curious. Peterson or Zizek?
I'm gonna have to go with Zizek
Okay.
for sure. Yeah, and it's like in terms of like just social stuff, I think I would agree more with Jordan, like in terms of problematizing, but at the same time Zizek does it as well. Like he problematizes like LGBT ideology as well, but in his own way, and I think he has some good critiques. But in terms of like as philosophers, like Jordan doesn't even call himself a philosopher. um I just they're not even in the same like realm. They're not even in the same realm of the depth to their thought. And I think that this is because with Zizek, he sort of reached a point where he's so close to Christianity. He literally calls himself an atheist Christian. He talks about the fall. He talks about original sin, like all of these concepts he has came to without God, that he's so close that all you need to do is just be like, hey, maybe there is a God, and then everything fits into place. But with Peterson, he's not so Zizek is so far away yet so close. Like he's so close that in order to maintain the atheist framework, he has to go so far away in order to justify it. Like he has to say that, oh, you see this lack in being, well, I guess reality, there's just a hole in reality. It's like, yeah, but there's a reason for that. That's just not the contingent of, like, that's what I would say. But for Peterson, he's just in a Christian enough framework where he isn't encountering these paradoxes in the same way. So even if I would say, like, when it comes down to it, my worldview is probably closer to Peterson, he's not as valuable because, unlike Zizek, he's not like right there on the he's not just right there, right on the line between Christianity. He's not, because Zizek is just so far opposed to Christianity, because if we're saying that self-relating is the opposite of communion, Zizek is the philosopher of self-relating. So he is as far away as you can be. But in being that far away, he is simultaneously very close. But for Jordan, he's just in the middle. So that's why I would say Zizek over Peterson.
Yeah. I mean, I've always loved his comments on, that atheism is, he's like the atheism Christian like paradox, right? I do feel like there is some like validity to that. And I did read a tweet today that said, atheism is the denomination of Christianity, which,
Yeah.
in my opinion, right? In my opinion, I find it funny because actually some of the anger, the sentiments that atheists have about Christianity is actually so Christian in nature, where they can't fathom, like, let's say they can't fathom like the cruelty and the suffering, right? They fundamentally want to believe in a good God, but it is sentimentally hard for them to kind of get their minds wrapped around this
Hmm.
theology, right? It doesn't make sense to them because experientially it's opposite. But in their sentiments, they really do want to believe in a good and all encompassing God. And and the other thing is, even if they are arguing against Christianity, the interesting stuff is that they have to basically, when they say that Christians are like hypocrites, right? They are holding a standard of Christianity that is so good and so high that no Christian can actually satisfy it.
Hmm.
And I think that's like the funny paradox is when I hear about atheism, um, and even your guy that you brought up that I had quoted him in a tweet before, um, where he talked, and
Ludovicos. Yeah.
yeah, I really need to read him because I thought what he was saying and what I highlighted was so brilliant when he talked about, when Christianity falls in a certain mindset, it is what nihilism comes out of. And
Hmm.
this notion of like will to power. I thought it was brilliant. And I never heard anybody explain it like that. So I
Right.
really do feel like analogical identities.
Yep.
I feel like that's a book that's gonna have to be on my next list. Um, so thank you for answering the question. I think somebody asked some questions before we wrapped up.
Oh,
I
sure.
think Reading Against Time said, I'll ask his first question. He said, "What is the Orthodox man's last name that described the Trinity as pure subjectivity?"
That would be Dumitru Staniloi, uh, a uh, Romanian theologian who it's in the book. It's in the book. The something that has church in it, and I think it has mystery in it as well. Um, a second, I'll just look that up. Yeah, it's he has a 6-volume book series called, in English, I think it's translated as The Experience of God. And my cousin has read most of it, I think. And I've only read a little bit of it, but the book that I got that from is called Theology in the Church. Theology in the Church. So, chapter 4, he talks about the Trinity. So even if you want to go and read that, like if you want an introduction to Staniloy, I would say you can find probably on Library Genesis, but I have a drive if you'd like that. I have a Google Drive link of Theology in the Church, chapter 4. He talks about the Trinity, and it's just so clear. Yes, very, very profound. I think Staniloy is one of the best. I'd say my 3 favorite theologians of the 20th century so far that I've read is, in order, Staniloy, C.S. Lewis, and G.K. Chesterton. So he would be my favorite.
Yeah, those are. I don't know the first guy. Obviously, that's why I need to read some of
Yeah.
his books. But C.S. Lewis and Chesterton, I heard, are really good, and I think C.S. Lewis was such a good introduction to reintegrate myself into
Right.
Christianity again by just by reading mere Christianity, just really basic principles.
Hmm.
And now I just tell people just to read it, just because if you just want like a nice fundamental understanding without getting involved in the high theology,
Yeah.
I think it's the best work ever. Um,
Have
okay,
you read Chesterton? Have you read
no,
Orthodoxy?
I have not. I
Okay,
plan on it.
I'd
Orthodoxy
suggest
by
that.
Chesterton.
Orthodoxy, yeah.
Okay. So Reading Against Time, he said thank you, and he also has another question. He said, "Please expand on the meaning of self-relating. What are some examples?"
Mm. Well, the fundamental example would be the subject, as described by Zizek. The subject is literally, for Zizek, the being that is nothing more than it's self-relating. This goes back to what Fichte calls the self-positing of the I. self-positing is different from self-understanding or even self-consciousness. Sartre talks about this as well, when he distinguishes between the cogito and the pre-reflective cogito. So the subject is one is on one side, it's the most difficult to grasp, but it's the most clear once you get it, because it's the very basic zero level of self-relating, as understood by these philosophers. So the subject is self-relating because the I equals I. So in Fichte, that's Fichte's famous formulation, I equals I. So what is the subject? The subject is the subject. It's nothing more than the sort of what Hegel would say, self-relating negativity that has become for itself. So the very withdrawal from the world, you are nothing more than this withdrawal from the world. You are the self-relating. Now, I don't fully accept that like as a Orthodox Christian, but there is a really, really good reading you can do of this from a Christian perspective, which I'm trying to do currently as I'm rewriting my book Aphasis, because that's the whole point of it. It's working through the subject and then coming out as Christ. I actually began writing the book as an atheist and ended it as a Christian. And like, believe it or not, I've said this before, but I literally became a Christian while thinking about subjectivity. So that's why it's such a important topic to me, is that my conversion literally occurred as I was thinking about subjectivity. So yeah, that's what self-relating would mean. So in terms of sin, like why is pride the fundamental sin? Like the first sin, it's because pride is self-relating in action. Instead of giving thanks to God, instead of humbling yourself and realizing that everything you have is from God, you try and act as if it came from you, when you are nothing. You literally are. You come from nothing. You are nothing without God. Actually, Thomas Aquinas talks about how creation ex nihilo doesn't just mean all of creation came from nothing, but it's that your very, like, the core of your being, in a way, is how does he put it? Sorry, I have it right here, so I'll just read that. He says that non-being is prior to being. This is a quote by Aquinas. Non-being is prior to being in the thing which is said to be created. This is not a priority of time or of duration, but a priority of nature, so that if the created thing is left to itself, it would not exist, because it only has its being from the causality of the higher cause. So that's basically scholastic terminology, saying that your nature itself is nothing in itself. Self-relating, you as you are nothing, because you as you doesn't actually exist. That's just a concept made in your fallen mind. You as you is ultimately you as participant in the life of God, because that's all you are. So that would be self-relating, and that's why self-relating is evil in Christianity, because it is the opposite of communion, and communion is being and goodness, because communion is the life of God himself as Trinity.
Brilliant. I mean, yeah, because I think it would solve a lot of problems if people would. I think I think we always face this gap, though, because like theologically, right, and even the way you perfectly explained it is like, as a self, I totally understand that, right? But I think the problem is when you get immersed into society and start talking to people and stuff, it's so easy to be like, but that's not how I feel about this. And it's funny because the moment you start saying that's not how I feel, you get caught in the perpetual self-relating negativity without you even realizing it. And it's almost like the self-relation, it doesn't even want you to acknowledge this, which is like very prideful in itself. And you could say, like, I wouldn't even say that you need, like, I would say like the subject is almost like the ontological proof of, Satan himself,
Yeah,
where
yeah.
if you get stuck in this perpetual self-relating negativity, it's like, that's all you really need to know for Satan. You don't need to see something crazy to realize this. It's just the very idea that you impose an I without understanding the I. And I love the way you put that, because that's why I really keep expressing, like, God himself is the only, you could say, pure subjectivity, but to put like a Heideggerian twist on it, is that thinking, if you really want to, take in a Heideggerian way, thinking is thinking. Thinking is being thankful, which I loved when Heidegger did, when he did like his etymology breakdown, is that we have yet begun to think. We
Yeah.
have yet to begun to
Yeah.
understand. And I'm not gonna lie, Trey, it always pisses me off when I read Heidegger, because I'm just like, I almost feel like the way you feel about Zizek. I'm like, dude, why don't you just admit there's a God? I don't
Yeah.
understand why you keep playing like this Gnostic game about like, if I say it, it's gonna go away. I'm like, please, for the love of God, just say it. Just say that you really are like
Yeah.
this undercover Christian. But I found my release when I started reading Henry Corbin, and he wrote this
Right.
wonderful book on, because I really do feel, I actually call Henry Corbin the mystical Heidegger, where he, he actually acknowledges a God, and so on. But other than that, I think we can wrap up. And if there's any last comments, I'll let you say it. And yeah.
You know what? It's been I've taken 2 hours of your time. I'd say that this was probably definitely one of the best conversations I've ever had. Yeah, I appreciate you just letting me, keep talking and stuff. And I'd be interested to have you on my channel sometime. We just got to figure out, a topic that you'd be uh comfortable talking about. And yeah, because this summer I'm planning on having like as many people as I can on, because I'm going to be working full time, so I'll have less time to make scripted videos. So I think that just doing more conversation style videos will be the best way forward for now. So yeah.
Okay. Yeah, we could talk about that. I mean, I could tell you right now, a lot of my work has been, from the beginning, has been on like dating and philosophy.
Mm,
But now I've been wanting to switch towards theology and dating, where
right.
we kind of like dissect some of the like the dating concepts and look at it theologically, like, why is marriage, why is like, one of my favorite things is like, the feminist critique isn't really valid, because Christianity has the concept of the one flesh, right?
Right.
The one
Right.
flesh, the idea of man and woman is actually not separate, it's actually
Hmm.
distinct, which we have to start
Hmm.
thinking, maybe genders as distinct rather than opposites and negation, which is
Right.
very important to think about. So
Right.
I really
And
feel like,
also, sorry to interrupt, but
no, you're good, you're good.
just really quickly, if you're interested in the specifically Christian view, I mean, ultimately, goes back to the Trinity as well, because the Son, even though we use the He, because the reason why we call the Son a He is because in our relation to the Son, C.S. Lewis talks about this, about how gender is distinct from biological sex. So in a way, even the deconstructionist, gender ideologues, they have sorry to sound like Jordan Peterson there, but even they have a point to make there. Even though, I mean, they're wrong in the way their conclusions, but gender is distinct from biological sex, because even we talk about the divine wisdom as feminine, but the divine wisdom is Christ. It's the Logos. So why do we use this? It's because femininity, being feminine, means you are in a passive reception of love, but to be the masculine figure is to be the initiator. And we really need to emphasize this isn't a relation of domination at all. It's not about authority here. It's about just the way the relationship occurs based on the Trinity, because the Father is always masculine, because the Father is giving life to the Son and the Spirit, right? And then the Son reciprocates it back. So, but the Son is female in relation to the Father. He is feminine in relation to the Father, because he is the one giving back what he has received. So all humans are feminine in relation to God. And that is how the Christian understanding of gender works. It has to do with reception and giving back, or what Pseudo-Dionysius calls procession and reversion. That's fundamentally what gender is based on, and it's based on the Trinity.
That wonderful. I mean, the only thing I would add is I've read somewhere, and I think I read through the perennial philosophy, is that the soul is ultimately feminine.
Mm,
And it blew my
mm,
mind because I was thinking about the way Mary basically is the one that bears Christ, right? Gives birth to
mhm,
God. And I was like, dude, this is brilliant. I mean, the fact that that is what we're all called to do essentially is to give this birth, becoming of this deity. Um, and it's, and Mary is such a good example for everybody to sort of be this, learning to bear God, so to speak,
right,
right? And then we can become, and then we go into imitating Christ. um
right.
Wonderful. Yeah, I really enjoyed this talk. So
Yeah, yeah. Thank you for having me on, and yeah, really great questions. And yeah, I always love to talk about Christianity and philosophy. So yeah, this
okay.
is great.
All right. Well, thank you guys for your questions, and Trey for being here, because I know he I didn't plan for 2 hours, but it just
Yeah,
I let it happen. So and I thought it was just going naturally. So
no,
yeah.
definitely. Yeah.
Yeah. All right, everybody, take care. All right, bye.